a silent platform, a vanished passenger, and a mystery frozen in time. Welcome to Silent Casebook. I am your host, Sterling. I love hearing from you. Comment where you're watching from today. Your messages make this mystery journey unforgettable. Let's begin. The station at Frostwood was small enough that a single bench seemed to own the platform. On most evenings, only the sound of the wind moved through it, carrying the faint smell of damp wood from the old freight shed. That Tuesday evening, the 6:40 train from Barrowford arrived as usual, 3 carriages, half empty, the metals squealing against the rails before the engine gave a tired hiss. The station master, Mr. Kellings, watched the handful of passengers step down. He knew almost all of them: the woman who ran the bakery, the young postman with the slouched shoulders, a boy carrying a violin case. They nodded or murmured polite greetings as they crossed the dim platform. Then there was the man with the grey hat. He had boarded here that morning, ticketed to Barrowford, and now he did not step off. The absence was subtle. No one gasped, no one shouted that something was wrong. It was simply that Mr. Kellings had expected the grey hat to appear, and it did not. By the next morning the talk had begun, not in alarm, but in that quiet, curling way a draught moves under a door. Mrs. Drew at the bakery asked whether anyone had seen the man from the night before. The postman thought he'd left with a small brown suitcase. No one remembered seeing him after the train pulled in. In Frostwood, things did not happen quickly. A missing man was not a crisis. Perhaps he had changed his plans. Perhaps he had taken the last coach to Henton. And yet by Thursday the police had come. They were polite, as if apologizing for the intrusion. Constable Leach walked the platform with a notebook, asking questions that felt smaller than the answers they were meant to lead to. No one had heard a struggle. No one had seen a fight. The man had been quiet, courteous, and carried himself as if trying to avoid notice. His name, according to the station's ledger, was Mr. Alfred Bremer. No one in town had ever heard of him before. Detective Marcel Horn arrived that evening on the 5:10 train. He travelled without ceremony. A thin man in a dark coat, carrying nothing but a leather satchel. He had been in Frostwood once before, years ago, for a burglary that left everyone uncomfortable when it turned out to be a family matter. When he stepped onto the empty platform, the air smelled of coal and wet leaves. Horn noticed the bench, the scuffed boards of the platform, the station master's way of keeping his hands in his pockets while he spoke. "Only the one man missing?" Horn asked. "Only him," Kellings said, looking past Horn toward the darkening tracks. "And even that, maybe he's not missing at all." Horn did not reply. He had learned long ago that people filled silence with the things they tried not to say. That night, Horn stayed in the small inn across from the station. From his window, he could see the empty platform under a single yellow light. In a place like Frostwood, nothing dramatic needed to happen for the air to feel heavy. The unease came from the people, the small, unconscious signs of discomfort, the baker avoiding eye contact, the postman pausing too long when asked a simple question. By the end of the week, Frostwood had become a town of lowered voices, not because of fear, but because of something harder to name, a collective unease, the kind that reminded Horn of old villages where a family kept a locked room no one spoke about. The disappearance of Alfred Bremer had not yet become a story. It was still only a feeling, stretching its shadow over a town where nothing unusual ever happened. And in that shadow, Horn waited. He had learned that mysteries, like guilt, rose slowly to the surface. The next morning, the sky over Frostwood was the colour of wet ash. A light drizzle coated the cobblestones outside the inn, leaving the town quiet but restless, as if the streets themselves were holding their breath. Detective Horn left the inn early, his coat collar turned up, and walked toward the station. The town seemed smaller in the grey light. Smoke rose from 2 chimneys only to vanish quickly in the damp air. He passed the bakery, where Mrs. Drew was arranging loaves behind the window. She glanced up, met his eyes, and then looked down too quickly, busying herself with a tray that did not need arranging. At the station, Mr. Kelling stood under the roofed section of the platform, sipping tea from a tin cup. His posture was stiff, his shoulders slightly raised, as though bracing against a wind that hadn't yet arrived. "Morning," Horn said quietly. Kellings nodded without speaking. He took another sip, his gaze fixed on the empty tracks. After a moment he spoke, his voice low. "It's strange. A man goes missing, and it's like the air changes. Folks look at each other different." Horn said nothing, letting the words settle. He knew people often spoke more when no answer came. "I've been here 32 years, Kellings went on, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "We get rain, we get snow, and sometimes we get folks who don't stay. But they always leave in the usual way, ticket in hand, step on, step off, not like this." Horn's eyes followed the line of the platform to the far bench. A thin film of water coated the wood. A single muddy boot print marked the edge, already softening in the drizzle. He wondered if it had belonged to Alfred Bremer, though he did not ask. He spent the rest of the morning walking through Frostwood, letting his presence drift through the town rather than announce itself. A detective in a quiet village had little use for questions at first. Questions made people guard themselves, observing them in their routines, told him more. Outside the grocer's, a man loaded a cart with sacks of flour, pausing to nod at Horn in wary acknowledgement. Inside, 2 women whispered near the pickle jars, their eyes flicking toward him, and then away. He caught fragments. "What, station? Strange business. Alone, wasn't he?" Their voices thinned when they realized he could hear. Horn bought a small tin of tea he didn't need and stepped back into the damp street. Across from the grocer's, a boy in a wool cap was sweeping water toward the gutter. He paused in his work, staring openly before ducking inside a doorway. By noon, Horn had formed no theories, but he had felt the weight of the town's unease. People were not afraid of crime here. They were afraid of being involved, of having their small, ordered lives examined too closely. He returned to the station and found Kelling sorting papers in the office. The little room smelled of old coal smoke and damp wood. On the desk lay a ledger open to Tuesday's entries. Horn traced a finger along the list of names and times. "Bremer," he murmured. Kellings glanced up. "Bought a return ticket. Simple as that. No baggage, but a small case." "Anyone speak to him?" Polite nods, nothing more. Horn closed the ledger softly. "People often notice more than they admit." The station master hesitated, his lips pressing together. Then he shook his head. "Ooh, he seemed tired. That's all I can say." Outside, the drizzle eased to a mist. Horn walked back toward the inn, taking the long route through narrow lanes. He passed a row of terraced houses with small front gardens, most overgrown. A curtain twitched in one window. Elsewhere, a door opened and shut without anyone stepping out. Frostwood was not unkind, but it was private in the way some places became when life offered more routine than change. That evening, he sat in the inn's modest dining room. A single oil lamp lit the space, casting soft shadows against the wallpaper. A young maid brought him stew without asking what he wanted. As he ate, he listened. 2 farmers discussed weather and feed costs in muted tones. A couple at the far table said nothing at all, their silence as thick as the steam from their plates. The only other conversation came from Mrs. Drew, who had stopped by to speak with the innkeeper. Her voice lowered when she saw Horn, and her hands twisted in the folds of her apron as she whispered something about the man from the train. Horn did not look up from his bowl. He had learned long ago that people spoke most freely when they thought no one was listening. After supper, he walked back to his room, pausing at the window again. The station light burned faintly across the road, the platform empty except for the rain-darkened bench. He stood for a long while, hands in his pockets, feeling the silence of the town settle around him. A single thought rose in his mind, quiet and persistent. This is not about where the man went. It is about why no one here can meet each other's eyes. As the clock in the hallway chimed 9, Horn turned away from the window. He felt the first stirrings of reluctant curiosity, an awareness that this disappearance was less an event than a mirror, and the town itself was starting to flinch from its own reflection. Rain lingered over Frostwood the next morning, soft and persistent, as if the sky itself had grown weary of holding it back. Detective Horn woke to the muted sound of it against the window-pane, and for a moment he remained still, listening to the hush that filled the small inn room. It was the kind of silence that belonged to places where people lived quietly, but carried their own unseen burdens. He left the inn just after 8, coat buttoned, hat pulled low. The street outside glistened, puddles gathering in the dips between cobblestones. Smoke drifted from the bakery chimney, curling into the damp air. Horn paused at the corner before crossing the street, watching the slow rhythm of the town's morning. Mrs. Drew emerged from her bakery with a broom, sweeping water off the front step. When she noticed Horn, her hands hesitated mid-motion. "Detective," she said, her voice careful, polite. Horn tipped his hat. "Busy morning?" "As busy as any," she said, though her eyes flicked toward the station across the square. "Feels quieter than it should somehow. People aren't lingering." Horn studied her for a moment. Her hands moved briskly over the broom handle, but her gaze didn't quite meet his. "You'd seen the man on the train, I imagine?" She nodded. "Twice, I think. Quiet man. Never bought bread, though. Just passed by." Horn let the pause stretch. Mrs. Drew's mouth tightened. "I can't say I know anything, but—" She stopped sweeping for a moment and leaned on the broom. "He looked lonely. That's the only word I can think of, like someone carrying his own weather." Horn nodded slightly, letting her words settle. He had learned long ago that small, emotional truths often weighed more than facts. He thanked her and moved on. His next stop was the post office. Inside, the air smelled of ink and damp paper. A single counter divided the small space, and behind it, the young postman with the slouched shoulders sorted letters with an almost forced concentration. "Morning," Horn said. The postman startled slightly, then nodded. "Detective?" "You were here the night Mr. Bremer's train came in." The young man hesitated, shuffling a stack of envelopes before setting them down. I was. I saw him step off the train in the morning when he first arrived too. He just drifted by, didn't seem to have a plan." Horn watched the man's hands. They moved quickly, unnecessarily adjusting the letters again. "You spoke to him?" "Only to say hello." He nodded, didn't smile. "And in the evening?" The postman paused, his eyes flicking to the door, as if to check they were alone. "I didn't see him get off the train. I thought maybe he stayed in Barrowford." "People do that sometimes." "Miss the return." "Or he never meant to return," Horn said softly. The postman's fingers stilled on the stack of letters. His throat moved as he swallowed. "You think something bad happened to him?" Horn did not answer directly. "Did he remind you of anyone?" The young man hesitated. "Maybe my uncle. He used to come back from the city looking empty, like he'd left something behind he couldn't get back." He shifted on his feet, then dropped his gaze. "I don't know if that helps." "It does," Horn said. He stepped outside again. The drizzle had eased to a mist, and the light had softened, giving the town a muted, grey calm. He walked along the edge of the square, passing the row of terraced houses. Curtains twitched as they had the day before, though no doors opened. Frostwood was watching itself now. In the afternoon, Horn wandered to the riverside path, a muddy track running behind the station. The river here was narrow and slow, carrying last autumn's leaves along its quiet current. A fisherman sat on an overturned crate near the bend, his line trailing lazily in the water. Horn approached, his step soft on the damp earth. The fisherman, a man in his 50s with a sun-worn face, nodded but didn't speak first. "Quiet out here," Horn said. "Quieter lately?" the man replied. His voice had the scratch of someone who spent more time outdoors than in conversation. Fewer folk walking the path, people keeping close to home. "They talk much about the man from the train?" The fisherman's jaw worked slightly as if chewing on an invisible thought. "They talk without saying anything. That's how it is here. Everyone's thinking the same thing, but no one will say it first." Horn crouched near the riverbank, watching the slow water. "And what is it they're thinking?" "That he didn't just vanish into air. Things don't happen without a reason. Maybe he fell, maybe he left, maybe—" He trailed off, glancing toward the distant rooftops of Frostwood. "Maybe someone knows more than they're willing to carry." The line in the water rippled, but the fisherman didn't react. Horn rose, tipping his hat slightly. "Thank you." "Not sure I said anything useful," the man murmured. "You said enough," Horn replied. By evening, Horn returned to his room at the inn. He brewed a cup of the tea he'd bought at the grocer's, its faint bitterness curling into the air. He sat by the window, looking down at the platform across the street. The bench was still empty. The single yellow lamp buzzed softly, haloed by mist. Horn thought about the words he'd gathered through the day. Lonely. Empty. Someone knows more than they're willing to carry. These were not the words of a crime. They were the words of a quiet fracture, the kind that spread through people before it ever broke the surface. Somewhere in Frostwood, he thought, a private shadow was shifting. Someone's life had been touched by Alfred Bremer in a way they did not want to admit, and in that small, unspoken connection lay the first thread of truth. He let the thought rest, his gaze lingering on the empty bench until the lamp flickered. He did not know if Bremer had left the town or if the town itself had swallowed him, but he felt certain of one thing. Frostwood was holding its breath, and sooner or later someone's silence would tremble. The steady drizzle had lifted by morning, leaving the streets of Frostwood damp and shining, as if the whole town had been quietly polished overnight. The air smelled of wet stone and chimney smoke. Detective Horn stepped out of the inn with no hurry in his stride. He had learned long ago that a case like this, if it could be called a case at all, was not solved by knocking on doors or demanding statements. It was solved by letting people talk in their own way, in their own time. He began his walk along the square, where the first stirrings of daily life were surfacing. Mr. Weller, the butcher, dragged a crate of meat through his doorway with a grunt, and the faint hum of a milk cart rattled down a side street. People moved with a quiet caution, as if their steps themselves carried secrets. Across the street, Mrs. Penwick was sweeping her front step. A tall, thin woman with sharp eyes, she wore her hair tied back in a severe bun. Horn had noticed her watching the station the day before from behind her lace curtains. Now she looked up as he approached, her broom pausing mid-air. "Morning, Mrs. Penwick," he said mildly. "Detective," she replied, voice tight but polite. "No news, I suppose?" "None official," Horn said. "Only impressions." She sniffed. Impressions won't bring a man back. Number, but they might tell us why he left or why he stayed unseen. He watched her face. Her eyes flicked toward the station, then to the wet street, as if weighing whether to speak. "I saw him," she said finally, voice softening. "The night he disappeared, just a glimpse from my window, he was standing near the lamp-post looking up at the houses as if deciding." "Deciding what?" She shrugged. "Whether to knock or keep walking. He didn't seem lost. He seemed—" She hesitated, the broom sliding slowly back to the ground, or like he was listening to something no one else could hear. Horn let the silence stretch, then nodded. "Thank you, Mrs. Penwick." He tipped his hat and moved on. Behind him he heard the broom resume its slow, careful strokes. By mid-morning, Horn found himself at the small cafe near the river. It was a narrow place with 2 tables and a counter, smelling faintly of coffee grounds and damp. Wood! The bell above the door chimed softly as he entered. The cafe's owner, Mr. Calver, emerged from the back room wiping his hands on a towel. His face carried the tired softness of a man accustomed to listening more than speaking. "Morning, detective," he said. Horn nodded. "Quiet as always?" "Quieter," Calver replied. "Since that man went missing, folks come in with their mouths shut. They drink, they leave. Even the rain feels louder than the talk." Horn took a seat by the window and wrapped his hands around the warm cup when it arrived. Across the street, he could see the river sliding past in its muted brown way. "Did you ever see him in here?" Horn asked. "Once," Calver said, leaning on the counter. He ordered tea, sat by that same window, didn't read a paper, didn't fidget, just looked out, like he was waiting for something to appear out there. Did anyone speak to him? Only Martha Greaves. She said hello. She says hello to everyone. And what did she think? Calver gave a small, thoughtful shrug. She said he smiled, but it was the sort of smile that makes you sadder than a frown, like he was already halfway gone. Horn nodded slowly. He sipped the coffee, letting the bitter warmth steady his thoughts. The rhythm of this place, its quiet talk, the pauses between words, told him more than any official statement could. Everyone here had seen something small, and those small things were starting to fit together, a man wandering, hesitant, listening to some private echo. After leaving the cafe, Horn took the path along the river, the same path he had walked the day before. The air was clearer now, and the mud clung less stubbornly to his boots. In the distance, he spotted Martha Greaves kneeling by her garden, trimming the wet edges of her rose bushes. Her bright scarf bobbed like a signal against the muted tones of the street. When she saw him, she rose and wiped her hands on her apron. "Detective, come to see if my flowers will give up the secret?" Her laugh was warm but carried a quiver under it. "I hear you spoke to the man at the cafe," Horn said. Oh yes, poor soul. He had the look of someone who hadn't heard his own name in a long time. "I just said good morning, but he seemed grateful for it." Imagine that. A grown man grateful for a stranger's hello. "Did he say anything in return?" She nodded, hesitating. He said, "It's quiet here, that's all." But the way he said it, like he'd been looking for quiet for a very long time. Her eyes drifted toward the river. "I keep thinking about it. A person can want quiet so badly, they'll do foolish things to find it." Horn watched her trim another rose stem. The petals, wet from last night's rain, trembled with each snip. He thought of the fisherman's words the day before, "Maybe someone knows more than they're willing to carry." He was beginning to feel the weight of it in this woman's gentle sorrow, in Mrs. Penwick's tight jaw, in the young postman's restless hands. Late that afternoon, Horn stopped by the station once more. The platform was empty, as it always seemed to be now. A porter in a worn coat leaned against the wall, smoking, his gaze distant. Horn approached, nodding in greeting. "Evening train's quiet?" "Quiet as a grave," the porter said. He flicked ash onto the wet boards. "Folk keep asking about that man. I tell them the same thing. He got on or he didn't. No one sees everything." Horn studied him. The man's voice carried a thin edge of defensiveness, the kind that came from being too close to an unanswered question. "You were here that night," Horn said. "You saw the train." "I saw the train," the porter said, exhaling smoke. "I saw people leave it, and I saw people get on. I don't take notes on their faces, but I tell you this, if he wanted to disappear, this town would let him. Frostwood don't chase after anyone, it just waits for you to come back, or it forgets you." Horn let the man's words settle in the misty evening air. There was a truth there, one that did not point to crime or innocence, but to the quiet resignation that hung over Frostwood. That night, in his room at the inn, Horn sat by the window again. The lamplight from the station wavered in the breeze. He thought of the fragments he had gathered, smiles that carried sorrow, glances that avoided the truth, words that hinted at lives half-lived in shadow. The town was speaking in soft, hesitant syllables. Beneath them he could almost hear the story forming, a man who came seeking quiet, a town full of people living in the long shadow of their own silences. He knew the next step was not to press harder, but to listen more closely. Frostwood would reveal itself in murmurs, not confessions. As he turned off the lamp, the faint echo of a train whistle rose from the distance, and Horn felt, for the first time, that the town itself might be trying to speak. By the third morning, the absence of the man from Frostwood Station no longer felt like a simple curiosity. It had become something heavier, a presence that pressed against the quiet routines of the town. It lived in the glances exchanged at the market, in the softening of voices when footsteps approached, in the way people seemed to look over their shoulders even in daylight. Detective Horn noticed it most in the stillness of the streets. Life went on. Carts rattled, dogs barked, shop doors creaked open. But beneath these daily movements ran a muted undercurrent of unease, like a low note humming through the town's chest. He left the inn after breakfast and walked toward the square. A light fog had rolled in from the river, softening the edges of the houses. The cobblestones were slick with dew, reflecting the pale sun like shards of glass. Near the grocer's shop, he saw Mrs. Harrow carrying a basket of apples. She was usually a brisk, no-nonsense woman, but today her movements were slower, her face drawn. She glanced at Horn as if deciding whether to speak, then lowered her eyes and fumbled an apple from her basket. It rolled toward the detective's feet. He picked it up and held it out. "Long morning?" he asked lightly. She accepted the apple with a strained smile. "Feels longer than it should. I didn't sleep well. I don't know. Thinking I hear something outside. Steps, maybe, or the train." Horn nodded. "Sometimes it's not the sound itself that keeps us awake. It's the thought that someone else might be awake with us." Mrs. Harrow swallowed, her fingers tightening on the handle of her basket. My husband says it's nonsense. He says the man probably wandered off to the next town, but I keep seeing his face. You saw him? In passing. He came into the shop for bread 2 days before he disappeared. He said thank you when I handed it to him. But his voice... She hesitated, searching for words. His voice made me think of a man leaving home for the last time. Not dramatic, not sad, just final. Horn didn't reply. He let her walk on, her shoes making soft, hurried taps against the stones. He had learned long ago that sometimes people didn't want reassurance. They wanted the echo of their fear acknowledged. By mid-morning, he wandered down to the riverbank. The fog was thinning, curling off the water in delicate strands. The fishermen were already out, their figures stooped and patient, silhouettes against the soft blur of trees. Old Mr. Pelham, the eldest of them, looked up when Horn approached. "Detective," he said with a nod, "you're still walking the same circles." "Some circles are worth walking twice," Horn said. "You hear anything in the night?" "Just the water. And the station bell, maybe. Or I dreamed it. Hard to tell at my age." Pelham shifted on his crate, his boots scraping gravel. "People are jumpy, like the fellow's ghost is already here, walking around." "You think he's dead?" Pelham shrugged. "Don't need a body to leave a ghost. Towns like this, we carry our guilt out in the open. When someone disappears, it feels like our fault, even if we never spoke to him." The words sank into Horn's thoughts as he continued along the bank. He had seen this before, in villages where a single tragedy didn't just touch the people involved, but spread like a fine, invisible dust over everyone, settling in their lungs. That afternoon, he visited Martha Greaves again. She was hanging wet laundry in her yard, the white sheets snapping faintly in the breeze. When she noticed him, she hesitated, then gestured toward the garden gate. "You look like a man who hasn't found what he's looking for," she said, voice low. "Sometimes what I'm looking for is not a thing," Horn said. "It's a feeling in the air, a change in how people move or speak." "Then you've already found it," she said, pinning a sheet to the line. "No one walks easy anymore. Even the children are quieter. My nephew asked me yesterday if the man would come back as a shadow. I didn't know what to tell him." Horn leaned against the gate, watching the sheet ripple. "Did you ever lose someone before, Mrs. Greaves?" "My brother," she said after a pause. "Went to the city, said he'd send letters. He didn't. People there said he was still alive, just gone. And somehow that was worse than a grave. That's what this feels like. Like we're holding our breath for something that isn't coming back." Her words resonated, weaving into the subtle pattern forming in Horn's mind. Frostwood was not merely worried, it was haunted by the idea of being left behind, of lives drifting into silence with no closure. However, that evening, the fog thickened again. From his room at the inn, Horn watched the dim light of the station lamp glow against the mist. He could see his own reflection faintly in the glass. A man who had spent his life observing other people's sorrows without letting them touch him too deeply. But this place, it was creeping in. He thought of Mrs. Harrow clutching her basket, of Martha Greaves speaking of her brother, of the porter with his quiet defensiveness. Each of them had attached their own ghost to the missing man. He had become a mirror for the absences they already carried. When the last train of the night groaned into the station, its whistle low and mournful, Horn imagined the missing man standing there again, hands in his pockets, eyes fixed on the quiet houses, listening for something he might never hear. The train pulled away, the mist swallowed the rails, and the silence that followed felt like the town's own heartbeat, slow and heavy. The next morning, Frostwood seemed quieter than usual. Even the sparrows outside the inn window chirped in a subdued rhythm, as if they too felt the heaviness that had settled over the town. Detective Horn rose early and took his coffee in the small dining room, listening to the soft clatter of dishes from the kitchen. The innkeeper's daughter moved briskly between tables, but her usual cheerful chatter was absent. After breakfast, he stepped outside into the cool, damp air. The mist had not yet lifted, hanging low over the rooftops like a wool blanket. He walked without urgency, letting his thoughts drift with the rhythm of his steps. The town's layout was becoming second nature, its tight streets, the narrow lane toward the river, the small square with its benches and modest fountain. Every corner carried echoes of glances and whispers from the last few days. Today, he decided, he would speak to Mr. Calloway, the station porter. The man had avoided his eyes each time they crossed. Paths. There was something behind that avoidance, not necessarily guilt, but perhaps a burden. Horn had learned over years of quiet work that avoidance often said more than words. Yet the station was almost empty when he arrived. A single cart stood near the platform, piled with coal sacks. The lampposts were still burning, their light blurred by the fog. Calloway was sweeping near the waiting bench, his movements slow and deliberate. "Morning," Horn said, his voice low but steady. Calloway stiffened slightly, then nodded. "Detective?" He continued sweeping, his broom rasping against the stone. Horn watched him for a moment before speaking again. "The man who went missing, you were probably the last to see him." The porter's broom slowed, then stopped. He leaned on the handle, staring at the empty tracks. "I saw him. He was waiting for the late train. Just stood there like he wasn't sure if he wanted to board or not." "Did he speak?" Calloway hesitated. "Not much." Asked if the train was on time. "I told him yes," he said. "Good." That was all. And then, Calloway's jaw tightened. "Then I turned my back to move a crate. When I looked again, he was gone." Horn said nothing. He let the silence stretch until the porter shifted uncomfortably. "People keep asking me the same thing," Calloway said finally. "Like I could have stopped him from vanishing, but I can't watch every man every second. Folks disappear sometimes, that's life." Horn nodded slowly. "Sometimes it's life, other times it's something heavier." Calloway's eyes flicked to him, wary. He didn't look like a man in trouble, just tired, like someone who'd been carrying a weight a long time. The detective absorbed this without comment. He had seen that kind of weight before. It rarely came from danger. It came from decisions that couldn't be taken back. Leaving the station, Horn followed the narrow path toward the row of houses behind the square. He had decided to call on Elsie Rudd, the widow who lived closest to the station. The previous evening someone had mentioned that she spent hours at her window watching the platform. Her house was small and neat, the curtains drawn against the misty light. He knocked gently at first, then a bit louder. Inside he heard the faint shuffle of feet, but no voice. "Mrs. Rudd?" he called softly. "It's Detective Horn. May I have a word?" A pause, then a voice, thin and trembling. I don't think so." "I'm not feeling well." He didn't leave. "I understand. I only need a minute. Sometimes the smallest things help." Another pause, then a click as the door opened a few inches. One pale eye peered through the gap. Her face was lined and tense, framed by wisps of grey hair. "What is it?" she asked. "You see the station from your window," Horn said gently. "You might have noticed something. Even a shadow, a movement. Anything unusual the night the man disappeared." She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder before speaking. I heard the train, same as always. I saw him on the platform, standing still. Then I turned away. I don't like to look too long at people waiting. Brings back memories. Horn waited. Her hand tightened on the edge of the door. I saw him lean forward, just a little, like someone listening for a voice. Then he was gone. I didn't see him leave. I didn't see a train take him. He was just gone. Her breathing quickened, and she closed the door a little more. I don't want to talk about it anymore. Please. Of course, Horn said softly. He stepped back, tipping his hat. Thank you for opening the door. When he turned to leave, he heard the faint click of the latch. Behind that door, behind her trembling eye, there was more. Not necessarily about the missing man, but about her own ghosts. Some people carried their pain like a second skin. They couldn't shed it, only hide it from the world. The day slipped by in muted encounters. At the grocer's, the whispers had grown. Two men argued in hushed tones near the flour sacks, their words breaking into fragments. Told him he shouldn't. Not our business. Already gone. Better that way. Horn didn't interrupt. He simply bought a loaf of bread and walked out, feeling the words follow him into the grey light. That evening, back in his room at the inn, he sat by the window again. The fog had thickened into a heavy curtain, and the lamplight from the station flickered faintly through it. He thought of Calloway's tightened jaw, Mrs. Rudd's trembling hand on the door, the men whispering in the shop. In Frostwood, doors were not only made of wood and iron. They were the invisible doors people closed around their hearts, locking away their quiet shames and regrets. The missing man had slipped through one of those doors, perhaps his own, perhaps someone else's. And now the town was left standing in the cold mist, pretending it didn't feel the draft. As Horn closed the curtains for the night, he had the distinct feeling that one of those doors would eventually crack open. And when it did, what came out would not be a clean answer, but something far more human, a truth wrapped in sorrow and silence. By the next morning, the fog had loosened its grip on Frostwood, though the air still held the damp chill of secrets left unspoken. Detective Horn walked slowly down the main street, his boots scraping softly against the uneven cobblestones. Shopkeepers were lifting shutters. A single horse pulled a cart of milk bottles, the clinking glass the loudest sound in the street. The town was awake, but the hush in the air suggested that people were speaking in low tones behind their doors. Whispers travel fastest when a town wants to believe it already knows the answer. Horn first noticed it at the bakery. He entered for a warm roll and a glance at the morning faces. Mrs. Keller, the baker's wife, greeted him with a smile that faltered as her eyes flicked toward a man at the end of the counter. A thin fellow in his late 40s, hair slicked flat as though he feared the wind. "Morning," she said, voice brighter than it needed to be. "Bit less fog today." Horn nodded, taking his bread. He followed her glance to the man who was standing very still, hands in his coat pockets, staring at the floor. A woman behind Horn whispered something just low enough to be indecipherable. He didn't turn. The weight of her words was already hanging in the air. When the man left, the bell above the door barely jingled. "Who is he?" Horn asked, keeping his tone casual. Mrs. Keller hesitated, smoothing her apron. "That's Harold Pike, lives down by the canal. Keeps to himself, people talk." "What do they say?" She lowered her voice. "That he's odd. Stays up late, walks alone, always watching the trains. Some say he's not right in the head, but he's never done anyone harm, far as I know." Horn thanked her and stepped back into the street, chewing his roll slowly. Harold Pike. a name to tuck away, though the detective knew better than to believe first whispers. A quiet man was often the easiest target for gossip, simply because he had no one to defend him. He found Pike by chance later that morning. The man was sitting on a bench near the canal, hands clasped, gaze fixed on the grey water. The stillness of his posture was almost rigid, like a figure in a painting. Horn approached without hurry and sat at the far end of the bench. Neither spoke at first. A gull called overhead. The water lapped gently against the stones. "Mr. Pike?" Horn said finally. The man flinched, then turned slowly. His eyes were pale blue, almost watery, and they held a kind of dull surprise. "Yes?" "I'm Detective Horn. I'm looking into the disappearance from the station. People say you spend time near the tracks." Pike looked down at his hands. "I like the trains," he said after a moment. "They come and go, always moving. I like to watch the lights fade." "Did you see the man that night?" A twitch of the jaw, then a nod. "I saw him." "Anything unusual?" Pike hesitated, as though weighing whether truth or safety mattered more. "He was talking. To himself, I think. Or to the air," kept shaking his head. Then he stood very still, like he was listening. "To what?" "I don't know," Pike said softly. "I don't think anyone else could hear it." Horn let the silence settle. He knew this was all he'd get for now. People like Pike rarely opened fully in the first meeting. Their truths had been worn down into fragments by years of solitude and suspicion. But by afternoon, the whispers had thickened into something sharper. At the small post office, two men leaned against the counter, speaking just loud enough for Horn to catch pieces, but always lurking. "Saw him there that night. See, if you ask me, he knows something." Horn pretended not to hear. But he noticed the postmaster's stiff nod, the way he avoided mentioning Pike's name, as though the mere word might carry guilt. By evening, even the innkeeper had adopted a tone of certainty. "They're saying it's Harold Pike," he murmured, as he cleared Horn's dinner plate. "Odd bird, never married, stares too much, not healthy, that kind of quiet." Horn only hummed in response, gazing out the window. He had seen this pattern before in small towns. A vacuum of answers always pulled suspicion toward the nearest lonely soul. And that night, Horn took a slow walk along the canal. The mist was thinner, and the lamps along the water cast trembling reflections. He found Pike again, standing under a lamp-post, staring at the river as though it could speak. "They're talking about you," Horn said, voice soft. Pike didn't move for a long moment. "I know." "Does it bother you?" The man's lips pressed together, then parted with a faint tremor. "It always happens. Any time something goes wrong, people look at me. Easier that way. I'm already alone." Horn studied his profile, the stiff posture, the tension around the eyes. He saw no violence there, only a man worn down by years of being othered. "They say you know something," Horn said. "I know." Pike's voice wavered, then dropped to a whisper. "I know he wasn't happy. I could see it in the way he stood, like the ground under him didn't belong to him anymore." He turned then, eyes glinting in the lamplight. "I didn't touch him, Detective. I only watched. That's all I ever do. I watch things go away." Horn walked back to the inn in silence, his hands in his coat pockets. He thought about the cruel efficiency of suspicion, how it could crush a man who was already bent under the weight of solitude. Yet there was still something in Pike's words that gnawed at him. "I watch things go away." Was it simply a lonely man's reflection, or a clue to something deeper? He couldn't yet tell, but he knew this. The town had chosen its suspect. and once a town made that choice, truth often became irrelevant. As Horn reached his room, the last lamplight flickering outside, he felt the shift in the air. The story of the disappearance was no longer about the man who vanished. It was about Harold Pike, the quiet figure who now bore the weight of Frostwood's unease. Somewhere beyond the mist, the real story waited, tangled in loneliness, shame, and the silent cruelty of small-town eyes. The next morning, Frostwood lay under a washed-out sky. The clouds stretched thin and grey as if the town itself had been exhaling, slowly, all night. Detective Horn left the inn just after sunrise, his collar turned up against the damp air. There was no plan for the day, no witness to interrogate, no evidence to gather. He would simply walk, as he often did, and watch. Horn had long believed that in towns like this the truth didn't hide in dark alleys or secret rooms. It lived in the way people avoided each other's eyes, in the stumbles of small talk, in the way doors closed a fraction too quickly. He started with the station. Frostwood Station had returned to its usual quiet rhythm, with only a handful of passengers waiting under the canopy. The platform smelled faintly of wet wood and cold metal. A station hand in a brown coat swept the floor, pausing every so often to glance toward the tracks, as if expecting something or someone. Horn leaned on the railing, observing the routine. The station master, Mr. Wilkins, emerged from his office with his usual stiff posture and checked his pocket watch 3 times in the span of a minute. He waved to no one, but his eyes flicked nervously toward the far end of the platform, where the night train had once arrived with its missing passenger. Wilkins saw Horn and hesitated, his hand hovering near his cap. "Morning, detective." "Morning. Quiet today," Horn said. Wilkins nodded but didn't meet his eyes. "Quiet's best." A pause followed. Horn noted the tremor in the man's fingers as he fiddled with his watch chain. Fear wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was the smallest tick in the smallest movement. "You've heard the talk?" Horn asked. Wilkins exhaled through his nose. "About Pike? Everyone has. Do you believe it?" The station master's shoulders lifted slightly, then fell. "I believe people want this to be over. A story's easier to carry when it has an ending." From the station, Horn walked toward the canal. He took the long way, passing rows of narrow houses where curtains twitched in his periphery. A dog barked twice, then fell silent. Halfway down the lane, Mrs. Grayson, the widow who ran the dress shop, stepped out to sweep her stoop. Her movements were sharp and rehearsed. When she saw Horn, she froze for a beat, then forced to smile. "Detective," she said, voice soft but strained. "Mrs. Grayson, how's business?" "Slow, always slow after things like this." She lowered her eyes, sweeping the same spot twice. Horn lingered. "You knew the man who went missing?" "No," she said quickly, too quickly. Then after a beat, "I saw him. Everyone saw him. He came into town a few times, bought a paper, stood at the station like he was waiting for someone who never arrived." Horn tilted his head. "Did he speak to anyone?" She hesitated. Her broom bristled against the step with a slow, deliberate stroke. "Spoke to Pike once or twice. People notice things like that. 2 men standing by the tracks in the evening. It's not natural." Her words carried a subtle bite, not just against Pike, but against the unease he represented. Horn thanked her and continued on, noting the small tension in her shoulders, the way she didn't wave goodbye. The canal was calm that morning. Mist clung to the surface, breaking in ripples when the occasional fish surfaced. A single barge moved in the distance, its engine droning like a tired hum. Horn found Pike sitting on his usual bench, elbows on his knees, staring at the water. The man's stillness was almost unnerving. He could have been mistaken for a statue, if not for the faint tremor in his fingers. "You're here early," Horn said, settling at the far end of the bench. "I come before the town wakes," Pike murmured. "It's quieter. No one looking at me." "They're looking a lot now." Pike nodded once, eyes never leaving the canal. "I hear them through the walls," whispers Carrie. Horn studied him, not speaking. A gull landed on the railing nearby, its head twitching as if listening to their silence. After a long pause, Pike spoke again. "I didn't touch him, but I saw him that night. He didn't want to be seen. I think he was leaving before he left." "Leaving before he left?" Pike gave a faint, humorless smile. "You can see it sometimes, in their shoulders, in the way they stand. Like they've already said goodbye to the world, but the world hasn't noticed yet." Horn felt the weight of the words settle like a stone in his chest. He knew that look. He had seen it in other towns, on other platforms, always in people no one wanted to see until they were gone. By afternoon, Horn returned to the town square and sat at the cafe terrace, ordering a small coffee he barely sipped. He wanted to watch people in their natural rhythm. A group of men lingered near the fountain, speaking in low tones. He saw the butcher lean toward the cobbler, lips tightening in that particular way that meant gossip had turned into certainty. Across the street, a young girl tugged her mother's hand, pointing at Pike, who had just crossed into view. The mother shushed her, eyes narrowing with quiet judgment. Horn caught subtle threads connecting everyone in that square, the way shoulders drew in when Pike passed, how laughter dimmed in his wake. The man had become a vessel for the town's collective dread. Later, he drifted to the edge of the woods, following the faint path that led toward the old telegraph post. There he found something small but telling, cigarette butts, 3 of them crushed in a tight circle in the mud. Someone had stood here waiting long enough to smoke them one by one. He bent to study the ground. Footprints were faint in the damp earth, one set heavier, another lighter, the impressions blurred by recent drizzle. He didn't need to know whose they were, not yet. In Frostwood, the land itself remembered what the people tried to forget. Evening fell quietly. The detective returned to the inn and took his usual seat by the window. He watched lamps blink on across the town, one by one, as if the night had to coax people into admitting the day was done. He thought about Pike, about Wilkins, about the widow with her rehearsed broom strokes. He thought about the missing man's invisible goodbye carried in the slope of his shoulders. And he thought about the way the town had already written its own ending, whether true or not. Horn wrote nothing in his notebook that night. He simply sat and listened to the creak of the inn's walls, the distant lap of the canal, and the silence that had begun to pulse with meaning. He realized that the investigation was no longer about finding a missing man. It was about uncovering the quiet grief the town carried, the shame that floated in every pause. By the time he went to bed, the detective knew the next days would bring a shift, not because of evidence, but because people, under the weight of their own fear, eventually cracked. And when they did, he would be there, watching, as always. The fog returned the next morning, thick enough that Frostwood seemed carved into fragments. Roofs floated above the grey, streets dissolved into soft nothingness, and footsteps were muffled, as if the town itself was holding its breath. Detective Horn walked slowly down the lane toward the post office. He had no appointment, no summons, only a faint instinct that something had shifted in the air. He had learned to follow that kind of silence. Inside the post office, The smell of dust and paper was heavier than usual. Miss Alder, the postmistress, looked up from behind the counter with the same polite stiffness she always wore. She was a thin woman with neat grey hair pinned back tightly, and her spectacles caught the dim light like small mirrors. "Detective?" she said, voice clipped. "Miss Alder," he replied. "Quiet morning?" "As quiet as it gets." She hesitated, her hand lingering on a stack of letters before she slid them into their pigeonholes. Horn watched the movement, the careful precision. He saw her jaw tighten just slightly. "You've heard the talk about Pike?" he asked, her mouth compressed into a thin line. "I've heard plenty. This town hears more than it should." Horn leaned an elbow on the counter, his voice light. "I suppose you see a lot running this place." "I see envelopes and stamps, nothing else." The answer was too neat, too defensive. He let the silence stretch until she shifted her weight, glancing toward the back room. Finally, she sighed and lowered her voice. "There was a letter for the man who went missing." Horn didn't move, didn't speak. He simply let her words hang in the stillness until she continued. "It came a day before he disappeared. No return address, just a short note. I think." He read it here. His hand shook while he held it. Then he walked out and didn't post a thing. "Do you still have it?" She hesitated, chewing the inside of her cheek. "I shouldn't, but—" She disappeared into the back room and returned with a single envelope, already opened. Its edges were soft from handling, and a faint fingerprint smudge darkened one corner. She placed it on the counter, as if it might burn her. Horn took it gently. The handwriting inside was uneven, hurried. "I can't carry this any longer. Someone will find out. I'm leaving Frostwood tomorrow. Don't look for me." No signature, no details. But the words carried weight, not just of escape, but of guilt. Horn read it twice, feeling the small tremor beneath its simplicity. He folded it carefully and looked at Miss Alder. "You didn't show this to anyone else?" Her eyes darted to the door before returning to him. "Number I. I didn't want to be part of it. People here, once they know you've kept a secret, you're stained by it." Horn left the post office and followed the canal again, his thoughts slow and deliberate. A letter like that didn't belong to a stranger. It belonged to a story that had been unfolding long before he arrived, a story the town had almost managed to bury under gossip and suspicion. He stopped near Pike's bench, but found it empty. Across the water, the windows of the old Miller house reflected the pale sky. It had been empty for years, the owner gone to a nursing home, but the place still felt watched, like a quiet witness no one questioned. That afternoon, Horn visited the station master again. Wilkins was in his office, polishing his pocket watch for the second time that hour. "Another quiet day," Wilkins muttered, not looking up. "Funny thing about quiet days," Horn said. "Sometimes they're when the truth slips out." The man's polishing slowed. "I don't know anything more than I told you." "I found a letter," Horn said softly. "A letter that says someone was leaving. Someone couldn't carry a secret anymore." Wilkins's hands stilled. He didn't ask to see the letter. He didn't have to. His silence confirmed enough. "Whatever happened at Frostwood Station," Horn continued, "it didn't start that night. It started long before. People usually leave because they're chased by something that doesn't move." Wilkins's eyes flicked up, wet and sharp. "This town doesn't forgive. You carry one mistake and it grows teeth. I've seen it eat people alive without a single hand raised against them." Horn let the words settle. He was less interested in the event than in the wound beneath it. Evening fell with a slow drizzle, blurring the lamps into halos. Horn sat in the cafe, drinking black coffee that had long gone cold. He wrote nothing in his notebook, only watched the street as Pike finally appeared, moving like a man wading through deep water. The fisherman stopped at the window but didn't come in. He lingered, then turned toward the canal, head bent. Horn followed him outside. "Evening," he said. "Detective," Pike murmured. "You knew he was leaving." The man's shoulders stiffened. A beat of silence stretched between them. "I didn't stop him," Pike said finally. "I thought maybe the leaving would be enough, but leaving never erases the thing you carry." Horn studied him. The second secret was not the letter. It was the shared knowledge that the town had pressed a man to vanish, and everyone who had seen the cracks had chosen silence. That night, Horn sat in his room at the inn, the rain pattering against the glass. He thought of the man on the platform, the letter in his hand, and the slow, suffocating weight of Frostwood's quiet judgment. Somewhere in that chain of small cruelties and unspoken shame, the truth of the disappearance had taken root, and Horn, as always, would not force it out. He would simply wait for the final piece to drift into the open, because secrets this heavy could only be carried so far before breaking the person beneath them. And the rain had stopped by morning, leaving Frostwood damp and shining in the weak light. Puddles clung to the cobblestones, and the canal swelled quietly under a low mist. It was the kind of morning where sounds carried farther than usual, the clatter of a cartwheel, the cough of a man unseen. Detective Horn stood at his window, his coffee cooling in his hand. The letter from the post office lay on the small table behind him. He had read it again before dawn, letting the plain words settle in his mind. Someone in Frostwood was breaking under the weight of their own silence. He didn't know who yet, but he could feel the pressure building, like frost, cracking inside an old pipe. He started his day with a slow walk through town. The butcher swept water from his doorway. A child ran past with a paper boat in the gutter stream. Ordinary life continued, even as something invisible crept through the streets. At the bakery, Mrs. Colson served him a stale roll without meeting his eye. Her usual chatter had dried up in the last 2 days. When he thanked her, she murmured something under her breath and turned to knead dough with harsh, rhythmic motions. Horn watched the flex of her shoulders. Shame often lived in the body before it reached the mouth. He stepped outside and found himself drifting toward the canal. Pike's bench was occupied this time. The fisherman hunched forward, staring at the water's surface, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had gone white. "You're early today," Horn said, settling on the far end of the bench. Pike didn't answer at first. A gull cried overhead. The faint ripple of a barge passed through the reflection of the clouds. Finally, Pike said, "I dream—" "About him? Not his face, just the empty platform?" Horn didn't press. He waited. "I used to think leaving was freedom," Pike muttered. "But he left, and now he's heavier than if he were still here. He's on every corner, in the water, in the air, like he's watching to see what I'll say." "You haven't said anything yet." Pike flinched, then nodded once, barely perceptible. "Not yet." The weight of unspoken things followed Horn into the afternoon. He visited the station, finding Wilkins pacing instead of polishing his watch. His steps were sharp, uneven, like a man trying to escape his own thoughts. "Morning," Horn said. Wilkins startled, then forced a smile. "Quiet day again. Quiet can be loud, in its way." Wilkins's eyes flicked to the floor. "I suppose." Horn leaned against the wall, hands in his coat pockets. "You said once that this town doesn't forgive." Wilkins swallowed. A bead of sweat shone at his temple. "I might have said that." "You also said mistakes grow teeth here." The The stationmaster's mouth opened, then closed. He sank into his chair, rubbing his eyes with the heel of his hand. "Detective," he said hoarsely, "I'm not a bad man. I didn't stop it. I told myself it wasn't my place, that it would sort itself out. But now it feels heavier." Wilkins nodded, breathing shallow. He didn't confess, not yet, but Horn could see the fracture widening. Guilt was like damp in the walls, quiet, patient, and relentless. By evening, the moral pressure was everywhere. In the cafe, conversations broke off when Horn entered. A glass clinked too hard against a counter. The young woman who served him tea wouldn't meet his eye, and her hands trembled slightly as she set the cup down. He thought of the letter again. "I can't carry this any longer." Someone in Frostwood was about to crack under the weight of shame, and when they did, it wouldn't be in the form of a clean confession. It would spill sideways, an outburst, a collapse, a whispered truth that slipped where it shouldn't. That night, Horn returned to his room at the inn and left the lamp low. He sat in the dark, listening to the muffled life of the town, the creak of a cart, a distant dog, the rain beginning again on the roof. When the knock came, it was soft, almost apologetic. He opened the door to find Pike standing there, soaked through, his face grey with exhaustion. His hat was crushed in his hand. "I can't sleep anymore," Pike said. His voice broke on the last word. "Every time I close my eyes, I see the platform, I hear the train, I feel him leaving, and I didn't stop it, I didn't say a word." Horn stepped aside. Pike didn't come in. He just stood there, shaking. "I thought if he left, the secret left with him," Pike whispered. "But it doesn't leave, it just sits here." He pressed, a hand to his chest, trembling. "What secret, Pike?" The fisherman's mouth opened, then closed. Tears gathered in his eyes, and he shook his head. "Not yet," he whispered. "Not yet." He turned and walked back into the rain, leaving Horn with the soft echo of his footsteps and the quiet certainty that the town was reaching a breaking point. The next morning broke with an eerie stillness. No wind rattled the shutters, no gulls cried over the canal. Frostwood seemed to hold its breath, as though the town itself sensed that something was about to give way. Detective Horn rose earlier than usual. He hadn't slept much, just light dozes broken by the echo of Pike's trembling voice at his door. He dressed in the grey light, buttoning his coat with slow, deliberate motions. The inn's hallway was empty, but the smell of damp wood and boiled coffee lingered. Outside, the streets glistened with last night's rain, puddles catching the faint reflection of the overcast sky. He began his walk through town, knowing without planning that his steps were leading him back to the canal. Pike's bench was empty. The water moved in soft circles where raindrops had fallen, and the old fisherman's absence felt heavier than his presence ever had. Horn stood there for a while, hands in his pockets, listening to the faint creak of a boat's rope against a post. The town was stirring now, windows opened, shop doors unlatched. People moved quickly this morning, heads down, as if eager to finish errands and retreat indoors. A hush clung to them, more oppressive than yesterday's rain. Horn wandered toward the bakery. Mrs. Colson stood behind the counter, her apron already dusted with flour. Her eyes were swollen, red around the edges, and she didn't bother to hide them. "You're early," Horn said gently. "I couldn't sleep," she replied, voice flat. She kneaded dough with mechanical force, her hands moving like a machine. "None of us can, I suppose, not after last night." Horn paused. "Last night?" She froze. The dough sagged between her fingers. She swallowed hard, then looked away toward the narrow back window that faced the canal. You haven't heard?" Horn didn't answer. He didn't need to. He found the small crowd first, not the scene. A handful of townspeople had gathered at the edge of the canal near the old bridge. They spoke in low voices, breaking off into silence whenever someone new approached. Wilkins, the station master, stood apart from them, hat in hand, his face ashen. When he saw Horn, his lips trembled as if he wanted to speak, but no words came. The fisherman's boat drifted gently against the stone edge of the canal, empty. A single oar floated nearby, caught in a tangle of weeds. "Pike?" Horn asked quietly. Wilkins lowered his head. They pulled him out just before dawn, near the bend. It didn't look like an accident. Horn felt the weight of the moment settle into his bones. He looked at the water, dull and grey under the sky, and imagined Pike's final steps, the slow walk, the rain soaking his coat, the crushing silence of the town pressing against his mind. The quiet collapse had come. The constable arrived late, clumsy and uncertain. A body in the canal was no common event for Frostwood, and the procedure was awkward, almost reverent. Pike was carried to a small storage shed by the dock, wrapped in a damp sheet. People drifted away after that, returning to their routines with a kind of forced detachment. Life in Frostwood demanded a quick return to normalcy, as if acknowledgement of tragedy risked letting it spread. Horn stayed behind. He didn't need to see the body. He had seen it already, in a sense, in Pike's eyes the night before. The detective spent the rest of the day walking, observing, listening. The collapse of one man's silence had rippled through the town like a stone in still water. At the post office, the clerk spoke in a whisper, her hands trembling as she stamped letters. At the cafe, a man spilled his tea and didn't apologize, staring instead at the table with unfocused eyes. Pike's death had confirmed something unspoken. The truth in Frostwood was no longer a private burden. It was now a shared weight, and every resident could feel it pressing down on them. In the late afternoon, Horn returned to the station. Wilkins sat behind his desk, hunched over, the watch he loved so much turning slowly in his fingers. "I should have done something," Wilkins said quietly. "You saw him last?" Horn asked. Wilkins nodded. "He came by the platform, just stood there. Didn't say a word. I thought about calling out, but I didn't. I just let him walk away. Thought maybe he wanted to be alone." "Maybe he did," Horn said. "But that's the thing, isn't it?" Wilkins's voice cracked. "We all wanted to be alone. We all wanted someone else to speak first. And now he's gone." Horn let the silence stretch. Wilkins's hand shook as he set the watch down, the faint click of metal against wood echoing in the room. Night fell quickly, as if the day itself wanted to end. Horn sat by his small lamp at the inn, watching moths circle the light. He thought about Pike, about the letter, about the countless small gestures and glances he had collected over the last week. This wasn't a mystery solved by a clue or a confession. It was a mystery that seeped into the soul of a town, eroding it from the inside until someone could no longer hold the weight. When Horn closed his eyes, he heard the soft lap of the canal against stone. In that sound, he thought he could hear Pike's last breath leaving him, a quiet surrender to the silence Frostwood demanded. Somewhere in this town the real secret still lingered, unspoken, but now it had claimed its first life. But the morning after Pike's death, Frostwood awoke as though nothing had happened. The bakery opened at dawn, the post office bell chimed, and the faint whistle of the early train carried through the mist. But beneath the rhythm of daily life, there was a subtle stiffness, a deliberate effort in every gesture, as if the town had collectively agreed to step around something heavy lying in its path. Detective Horn walked slowly through the square, feeling the weight of that unspoken agreement. He watched as Mrs. Colson handed a loaf of bread to a young mother, forcing a polite smile that didn't touch her eyes. At the corner, two fishermen chatted about the weather, their voices too loud, too cheerful. The death of Owen Pike had been quietly decided, an accident. Horn had overheard it the evening before, whispered between neighbours as they drifted away from the canal. Slipped in the rain. Poor old man. The story spread like a soft blanket, comforting in its simplicity. Even Wilkins, pale and hollow-eyed at the station, repeated it that morning. "Terrible thing," he said to Horn, his voice brittle. "He must have lost his footing. Wet stones. Dangerous this time of year." Horn didn't argue. He nodded as if the words fit. But in the private room of his thoughts the lie throbbed. It wasn't the kind of lie told to deceive, it was the kind told to survive. He stopped by the canal mid-morning. The water had returned to its usual stillness, reflecting a pale, empty sky. A bouquet of wildflowers rested on the stone edge where Pike's boat had bumped the night before. Someone had tied them with a string, the stems uneven, as if done in haste. Nearby, two old women spoke in hushed tones. "Such a shame," one said, "but he was getting strange, you know, sitting by the water all hours." "Rain'll do that to the stones," the other replied. "Slippery as glass. Could happen to anyone." The first woman hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Suppose it's for the best we remember him kindly. No use stirring things." Horn turned his head slightly, letting the words settle in. No use stirring things. It was the unofficial motto of Frostwood, a town that wore silence like armour. In the afternoon, he visited the cafe. The smell of boiled coffee and damp wool hung in the air. Only a few customers lingered, and the usual quiet murmur seemed more cautious than ever. The young woman who served him, a girl no older than 20, placed his cup down with a small clink and leaned in slightly. Her voice was barely audible. "They'll say it was an accident," she whispered. "But he came here the day before. He was shaking. I gave him tea for free." Horn studied her face, soft with youth, but tight around the eyes. "And—" She glanced toward the other tables, then back. "He said the town was full of ghosts. That was his word. Ghosts. I asked him if he meant the dead, and he said no, he meant the living. Then he walked out, didn't even drink the tea." Horn said nothing. He lifted the cup to his lips and let the steam rise, warming his face. By the time he left, the girl was smiling brightly for another customer, her whispered truth swallowed by the larger lie Frostwood had chosen. That evening, an informal gathering formed at the town hall. It wasn't an official memorial, just a chance for the townspeople to speak Pike's name in a way that felt safe. A few candles flickered on a table. Someone had brought a photograph of Pike from 20 years ago, smiling beside a catch of fish. Wilkins spoke first, voice steady. "He loved this town," he said. "Even when he kept to himself, he was one of us." Murmurs of agreement rose. Someone sniffled softly. Then Mrs. Colson added, "He was a good man. It was an accident. That's all we need to say." Heads nodded. A murmur of yes, yes passed through the small crowd. No one wanted to discuss the empty platform, the trembling hands, the letter in the post office. No one wanted to wonder why a man like Owen Pike would choose the canal over his bed. Horn stood in the back, arms folded. He could feel the lie settling into the room, like dust coating every surface, softening the edges of reality. It wasn't malicious. It was a collective act of mercy, or perhaps cowardice. He noticed one man in the corner, a farmer with a weathered face who didn't speak or nod. Their eyes met for a brief second. In that flicker of recognition, Horn sensed the truth. There were still those who carried the heavier story, silently. When the gathering ended, the town felt lighter, almost relieved. People emerged into the evening air as if a weight had been lifted from their shoulders. By agreeing on the accident, they had locked the darker truth in a box and buried it beneath routine. But Horn knew boxes like that didn't stay closed forever. Guilt had a way of seeping through the seams. He returned to the inn and sat at his desk, the lamplight trembling with the draught. He wrote a single line in his notebook. The lie everyone accepts is the most dangerous kind of truth. Outside, Frostwood exhaled into its familiar silence, a town that had survived another day by pretending. The next morning arrived with a pale, unremarkable light, as if the sun itself hesitated to commit to the day. The streets of Frostwood were damp but calm, smelling faintly of coal smoke and wet earth. The canal, so recently a site of quiet tragedy, had returned to its glassy indifference. Detective Horn sat by the window of his small inn room, the same wooden chair creaking softly beneath him. He sipped his coffee, lukewarm and bitter, staring at the square below. Townsfolk moved with an ease that felt carefully performed. A nod here, a wave there, nothing out of place. Pike was gone, buried beneath the official story. He slipped. Poor man. And yet, Horn could still feel the pulse of the truth under Frostwood's skin. It wasn't that the town didn't know, it was that they had chosen not to. He wandered out mid-morning, his coat collar turned up against a light breeze. Mrs. Coulson was arranging pies in her bakery window, her posture rigid. When she saw Horn, her expression softened just enough to pass for polite friendliness. "Morning, detective," she said. "Morning." He paused. "Busy day?" "Always," she replied, but her hands stilled for a fraction of a second. Then she added, too quickly, "Good that things are settling down." "Settling down," Horn echoed. He let the words hang in the air. He could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers gripped the pie tin as if to anchor herself. He thought of asking more, of pushing just a little, but he didn't. Instead, he nodded, offered a faint smile, and moved along. And the town square felt smaller than it had a week ago. The shop doors were all open, but the air was heavy with avoidance. A fisherman mended his nets on the canal's edge, humming tunelessly. Across the way, two men shared a quiet smoke without speaking. Everywhere Horn went, silence followed. Not the absence of sound, but the silence of unspoken things. He could feel it in the gaps of conversation, in the half-averted glances. By noon he found himself on the bench near the canal, the same one Pike had occupied in his final days. He imagined the old man sitting there, coat damp, staring at the water, while the weight of his secret pressed in. A gull wheeled overhead. Horn followed it with his eyes, letting the slow drift of the day pass over him. In the afternoon, the constable approached him. A young man with a ruddy face, still awkward in his uniform, he carried an air of rehearsed confidence. "Thought I should tell you," he said, scratching the back of his neck. The inquest settled. Officially, accidental drowning. Horn studied the young man's face. "That was quick." "Small town," the constable said with a shrug. "No need to drag it out. Family's satisfied. Folks need to move on." Horn didn't correct him. He simply said, "I see." And in that moment, he realized that his role here had shifted. He was no longer a seeker of truth, not in the official sense. Frostwood had decided what truth it would live with, and no external force, no detective, no inquiry, could change that. But that evening, Horn returned to the inn early. He lit his lamp and opened his notebook. For a long time he stared at the blank page, the tip of his pencil resting just above it. "Do I speak?" he wondered. "And to whom?" He thought of Pike, of the quiet desperation that had eaten away at the old man until he could no longer carry it. He thought of Wilkins, fiddling with his watch, and Mrs. Colson, kneading dough as if to keep her hands from shaking. He thought of the young cafe girl, whispering about ghosts. The truth was simple, but corrosive. Someone, maybe several someones, had driven Pike to the edge. A letter, a whisper, a long shadow of guilt. But naming it wouldn't heal the town. It would only rip the wound open. Horn closed the notebook without writing a single word. And the next day he paid a quiet visit to the small cemetery on the hill. The grass was still wet with dew, and the air smelled of moss and earth. Pike's grave was fresh, the soil dark and unsettled. No headstone yet, just a small wooden marker with his name written in chalk. Horn stood there a long while, hands in his pockets, the breeze carrying the distant sound of the canal. He didn't speak aloud, but in his thoughts he said, "I know, that's enough." As he left the cemetery, he passed a pair of townsfolk on the path. They offered him polite nods, their expressions carefully neutral. For a fleeting moment he wondered if they knew that he knew. Perhaps that was part of the unspoken contract now. His silence was as necessary as theirs. So that evening he sat in the inn's small parlour, watching the last of the light fade from the windows. He listened to the town's familiar sounds, the creak of a cart, the distant bark of a dog, the slow lap of water. It struck him how little Frostwood had changed, despite everything. A man had died, secrets had pressed against their fragile routines, and yet the world here had folded back into itself. Detective Horn realized then that his investigation was over, not by resolution but by surrender. He would carry the truth alone, not because he was complicit, but because speaking it would change nothing. In Frostwood, silence was the only justice anyone was willing to accept. Morning light slanted through the narrow streets of Frostwood, catching on wet cobblestones and the peeling paint of shop fronts. The town had resumed its usual rhythm. Wagons creaked, children ran errands, and the post office bell rang in its familiar, almost comforting way. Detective Horn watched the scene from a bench near the canal. It had been over a week since Owen Pike's funeral. The flowers on his grave would now be wilting. Life, as it always does, had absorbed the loss and filed it away somewhere quiet. A soft mist clung to the water, and the only sign of the recent tragedy was a single white feather floating near the stones. It drifted slowly, catching the light, before vanishing beneath the ripples. Across the square, Mrs. Colson opened her bakery. She propped the door wide to let the smell of warm bread escape into the street. A child approached with a coin in hand, and she smiled, bright and effortless, as though her hands hadn't trembled a week ago kneading dough. Horn saw Wilkins too. The station master had returned to his usual routine, tipping his cap to passing townsfolk, checking his pocket watch with habitual precision. Only once did Horn notice his hand pause, a flicker of hesitation before the mask of calm slid back into place. The town was whole again, at least on the surface. Horn wandered slowly through the streets. The air was clean after a night of light rain, and the distant hills looked sharp against the sky. He passed the cafe where the young waitress had whispered about ghosts. Through the window, he saw her laughing with a customer, her hands moving with youthful energy, her face free of shadows. If she noticed Horn walking by, she didn't show it, or maybe she chose not to. That afternoon, Horn took the path up to the small hill overlooking Frostwood. From here the canal glinted faintly, and the rooftops made a patchwork of muted colours. He could hear the faint hiss of the train as it slowed at the station, a sound that felt like the town breathing. Pike's grave lay among a cluster of older headstones. The wildflowers had drooped, their colour fading. A soft breeze stirred the grass, and the wooden marker creaked slightly in its place. Horn removed his hat and stood for a moment, his gaze drifting across the quiet cemetery. He thought of Pike's last days, his restless pacing by the water, the way he avoided people but seemed unable to leave the open air. He wondered if the man had known that the town would carry on as though he'd never existed, except in whispers. There was no bitterness in the thought, only a dull weight of acceptance. Life moved forward, even when truth stayed behind. On his way back down the hill, he passed two farmers walking toward the village. Their conversation drifted to him in fragments. Shame about Owen. Well, he was tired. These things happen. The words were soft, almost rehearsed, like a line spoken too often to maintain its shape. Horn didn't interrupt. He let the murmurs fade into the wind. That evening, he returned to the inn and packed his small bag. His time in Frostwood had run its natural course. There were no reports to file, no suspects to confront. Officially, the matter had ended the day the inquest closed. He sat at the small writing desk once more and opened his notebook. This time, he allowed himself a few lines. The town endures. The truth does not. Some lies are not lies at all, but a way to keep breathing. He stared at the words for a long time, then closed the book without signing his name. As dusk settled, Horn took one final walk through the square. The lamplighter was making his rounds, and the soft glow of gaslight stretched long across the cobbles. A dog barked somewhere distant. A woman hummed a lullaby from an upstairs window. No one stopped him. No one asked about Pike anymore. He paused at the edge of the canal, where the water caught the orange hue of the lamps. His reflection wavered alongside the dark sky, and for a moment he felt like a ghost himself, someone who had passed through the town without leaving a mark, carrying a story that would never be spoken aloud. The faint whistle of the night train drifted through the air. He would leave with it, and Frostwood would remain exactly as it was, a place where silence was its own kind of survival. Years had passed since Detective Horn had last walked the streets of Frostwood. Time, like the river by the canal, had carried life onward without ceremony. Seasons had turned the hills golden, then white, then green again. The town had remained a quiet crease in the countryside, its routines undisturbed. Horn had retired by the time the letter arrived. It came in an envelope with no return address, written in a narrow, careful script. The handwriting struck him immediately, measured, patient, the kind of penmanship belonging to someone who had spent a lifetime thinking before speaking. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Detective Horn, I don't know if you remember me, but I was the station master in Frostwood. I think it's time someone told the truth. Not the one the papers printed, or the one we let the town believe. The real one, Owen Pike, didn't slip. Horn sat at his small desk, the window open to the soft clatter of a coastal town far from Frostwood. His fingers lingered on the page, the paper thin but heavy with the weight of years. The letter continued, unspooling the secret that Horn had suspected but never heard in words. We found the letter in his coat pocket after they pulled him from the water. It was addressed to me, though I think it was meant for all of us. He wrote that he couldn't bear the silence any longer, that living among us was like standing in a room where everyone whispered about him but never spoke to his face. It wasn't guilt about a crime. There was no crime. It was the guilt of being unwanted. We had made him an outsider in his own town. The way we crossed the street when we saw him, the way we lowered our voices in the cafe. He said he could feel our thoughts like stones in his chest. He walked into the water because he was already gone to us long before that night. Horn read the words twice. They were spare, plain, and final. There was no mention of who had started the whispering or why the town had quietly turned its back. It hadn't been one act, but a slow accumulation, years of suspicion and avoidance, casual cruelty disguised as habit. The letter ended with a single line that lingered in Horn's mind long after he folded it. We buried the letter with him. The town could not survive the truth, and maybe it still can't. But I needed someone to know. Horn leaned back in his chair, letting the sea breeze lift the edges of the paper. He thought of Frostwood as it had been, the bakery windows fogged with steam, the soft clatter of the cafe, the canal reflecting, the low sky. He saw Pike, coat buttoned tight, standing alone by the water. He saw the townsfolk pretending they didn't see him. In all his years as a detective, Horn had learned that the most enduring crimes were rarely written in law books. They were the quiet injuries people inflicted simply by looking away. That autumn, Horn found himself travelling north again. He told himself it was for the scenery, the stillness of the hills, but in truth, he wanted to see the town one last time. Frostwood had aged only a little. The paint on the shop fronts had faded, the cafe had a new awning, and the canal's water was lower than he remembered. Life moved with the same deliberate rhythm. No one recognized him. He passed through the square as a stranger. Children ran by with a ball, laughing. A young woman swept the bakery steps, perhaps Mrs. Colson's daughter or granddaughter. Horn climbed the hill to the cemetery in the late afternoon, when the light had begun to lean toward evening. Pike's grave had a proper headstone now, grey and modest, with his name and the year he died. Someone had left fresh flowers, wild daisies from the fields nearby. Horn stood there for a long time, the wind moving through the grass in soft waves. He thought of the letter in his coat pocket, and of all the words that had gone unspoken in that town. On his way back down, he paused by the canal. A group of children were skipping stones, their laughter echoing over the water. The same water that had taken Pike now shimmered as if it had never known sorrow. Horn realized that the town had done exactly what it had intended all those years ago. It had survived by forgetting. The truth, if spoken aloud, would have been a weight no one wanted to carry. And yet, in some quiet way, it lived on, in the unmarked spaces, in the pause between greetings, in the occasional flower left on a grave by hands that still remembered. He didn't speak to anyone. He didn't tell them he knew. He simply walked to the station, boarded the evening train, and let Frostwood fade from view through the window. Back home that night, he placed the letter in his desk drawer and closed it gently. He did not plan to share it. Some truths, he thought, were not meant to change the world. They were only meant to settle in a single heart, so that someone, somewhere, carried the weight for the rest of the world. As he extinguished the lamp, Horn felt no triumph, no relief, only a deep, lingering quiet. Frostwood would live in his memory not as a place of crime or deceit, but as a reminder of how a life could vanish without a single hand being raised, only eyes turning away. The sea wind rattled the window once before the night took the room. And in that stillness, Owen Pike's story, now fully known, joined the long chorus of unspoken truths that had always followed Detective Horn, like the echo of footsteps on an empty street.